And as I already mentioned to some folks who have joined us earlier, we have a lot to cover today, so we're going to jump right in and get started. Um, and you can go to next slide, but also if you want to share slide control with me,
Oh,
Jackie,
I
that'd be
can't.
great.
I
Yeah,
can't because I'm
no
doing
worries.
we're doing the whiteboards today, but I can just let me know when to go to the next one.
Perfect. So just a few nuggets from last week, and I think this was plenty because I think folks hit it on. I mean, last week we talked a lot about the importance of validation, empathic listening, and really all of the factors that kind of lead to really a strong relationship. As we talked about those common factors, I know I mentioned a little bit of the research that shows the common factors really shows that it's the real relationships. It is being able to deal with ruptures in the relationship and collaboration and empathic listening and all of those things that really drive outcomes over and above what we know from evidence-based treatment. So these are some of the things. There are endless ways to validate. I think I mentioned last week I was listening to a talk by Marsha Linehan, and yes, she talks about validation in her work with folks who've been exposed to trauma and folks with living with borderline personality disorders. It's all about validation. And then the therapeutic relationship parallels the relationship that folks come in life. That oftentimes what we can see in therapeutic relationships is this reenactment of past traumas playing themselves out in our relationship with folks. So but sort of developing and this can take time and effort, but it can take all the things that we talked about last week and that we're talking about right now that leads to developing an honest relationship, a trusting relationship between you and the people that you work, and that's what drives outcomes. Um, and so those are some things. Anyone want to share any additional insights, thoughts, anything from our training that you're kind of seeing play itself out in your work? If anyone wants to share quickly, please unmute yourself or chat in. Anyone want to share a reflection from their work? Raise a hand. All
Anything
right. Yeah. And
people reflected on it all this week or came up, in conversation?
this is a good place, and please feel free to chat those in again if you have any additional thoughts. Um, so next slide. So, as we've talked about in previous weeks, creating safety, we talked in our second week about creating safety, the importance of that. Excuse me, in our second week, the importance of creating safety, staying out of judgment, and certainly, again, just to be clear, the reason why we talk about that is because judgment is what often leads to those ruptures in the relationship. If we're sort of stuck in our own judgments, our own biases, it can interfere with the therapeutic relationship. And then last week we focused a lot on providing empathic responses that includes all those things that we've already touched on, the importance of validation and other factors that help to develop a strong therapeutic alliance and maintain that alliance over the course of work. Today, we're going to talk about providing information. How do you provide information to folks in a way that's effective and helpful to the folks that we serve? And then also supporting regulation. And I want to say just really quick about supporting regulation. Again, oftentimes when you're talking about supporting regulation in therapy, there are many different approaches. Just a reminder, with STARS, we're talking about the basics. Those basics can be very helpful. And what I mean about the basics is that sometimes supporting regulation can mean a combination of, cognitive restructuring strategies and working through folks' minds, helping folks to cope and deal with their physiology and developing relaxation skills and ways where they can calm themselves down. We're talking about the very basics here that you can kind of use throughout the work. So we're going to talk a little bit about some simple things that you can do to support regulation. Again, oftentimes many evidence-based treatments that are developed have very specific techniques and strategies for doing that that might take a long time. What we're talking about is just some simple tools that you can carry with you to support regulation when it's necessary in the course of your work. And then next week, of course, we'll be talking about connecting supports. This is our next to last session. So next week, we'll talk about connecting to supports and sustaining the work. How do we support you all in doing this very difficult work? Next slide. So really quick, we're gonna go through a little bit of an exercise in a minute, but providing information. And we're going to ask you all to share information, but please feel free to chat in your thoughts about the importance of providing information. I also want to be clear here, we're talking about providing information. Um, in previous versions of this, we talked about psychoeducation, but we really wanted to make it, as we've talked about throughout this training, we want to make this talk about these things in conversational ways. How do you provide information in ways that are useful to the folks that you work with? Again, we often think about this as psychoeducation, and that's part of it. But we're going to talk a little bit about a few different ways in which we can provide information that can be useful to folks today. But I just want to mention a few benefits of providing information. One of them is, again, it can reduce stigma. As we've talked about in the past, when we think about trauma-informed care, it's not about what's wrong with you, it's about what happened to you. If we're giving good information about the impact of trauma, it helps deepen their understanding, our clients' understanding of that point, that it's not what's wrong with them, it's about what happened to you and how what happened to you can impact the way you deal with and cope with daily lives, with things that happen in your daily life. So it can reduce stigma, it can reduce this idea that it's all on them, it's their fault for their problems. It can provide clarity for folks. Oftentimes, when I'm providing information to folks, this is where light bulbs can go off. You can see those aha moments for some folks when they're learning something new that can help them understand what's going on with them. It could also provide hope. So when we talk about providing information, we don't only talk about how trauma impacts you, but we can also talk about the reality of what creates resilience, what helps to promote resilience, what helps people heal and recover. Um, and then it can normalize as this, and this overlaps somewhat with what we talked about last week with validation. Validation, right? Just to remind folks, it's validating folks for understanding their thoughts and feelings and behavior, validating those things as their responses to and sometimes to traumatic events. But it could also help to normalize the behavior by helping folks understand that some of the things that impact them, so some of the information we're going to share with you today and some of the things that you can do can help to sort of normalize their experiences. So with that said, I just want to, so next slide. And so what we're going to do is talk a little bit today about the what, the when, and the how for providing information. What information would be most useful and helpful to the person? What helps them to develop that clarity and help them normalize their experiences? When is a good time to introduce relevant information? And then the how. What are some good ways to provide information? And we do believe that the answer to these questions are there, and it's always a matter of trying to figure out what, again, these important factors: what, when, and how to provide information. With that said, I'm going to transition and pass it over to Jackie to talk a little bit about for you all. So part of this is we're going to provide you some thoughts about things that you may consider putting into your toolbox of information you can share, but also we want to start with you all. What is information that you have found helpful to provide people impacted by trauma, your clients? Where do you see those aha moments? Where do you see information that can really help clients understand what they're going through? So please unmute yourself, chat in, use the chat, but we want to hear from you first. What type of information do you provide the folks that you serve? And what have you found helpful?
One of the things that I found helpful was kind of normalizing the overlap between ADHD and trauma symptoms. I work with youth, and a lot of times they're like, oh my God, that makes so much sense once they realize that some of the trauma symptoms they may be experiencing might not just be ADHD, it could be from trauma.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really helpful. I feel like,
That's fantastic. I'm
yeah,
sorry, who was sharing that? I wasn't keeping up with the, I couldn't tell.
that was Caitlin.
Caitlin, thank you, Caitlin. Yeah, and that's one of those areas. That's a great example because sometimes there is so much overlap. By the way, and we're going to talk a little bit about this in a minute, but there's also overlap. You can also think about there being overlap between trauma symptoms and depression and anxiety, right? Of course, and anxiety being one of those. But yeah, how? And I think what's important about that, Caitlin, and for everyone, is that again, if you know and you have determined that there's a history of trauma, that discussion becomes more relevant. This is why, as we talked about last week, asking questions, being curious, understanding the person's narrative. When you know those, you can then connect the dots and help folks understand that difference. Great. Others?
So I took from
Oh,
Melissa
yep.
in the chat,
Thank you.
different parts that impact the brain and biological symptoms, different part of the brain. That's great. It's gonna be a big focus.
Melissa says it does help at times to provide education related to the impact of trauma on the brain and bio.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. That's what you, sorry, Jackie.
Okay.
Great.
That's great. Yeah, we're gonna be talking
Others.
a little bit about that.
Yeah. Others. Any others? What have you found where, providing information gives your clients that aha moment, that ability to understand their responses, their thoughts and feelings and behavior and context?
Well, as I said, I work with in a preschool with children with developmental
Mhm.
preschoolers with developmental disabilities. So it's not exactly a social service agency or mental health or trauma, but certainly there are aspects of that. We're really helping parents to connect with having a child with this. We see a lot of range of reactions and response to having a child, a young child with a developmental disability, but connecting that to a grief response, to grief, to grieving, because many of our parents have not, and what you see is a lot of sometimes anger, projection of feelings, but a lot of it is related to grief. That this is the loss of
Yeah.
the child that you thought you would have,
Mhm.
and to begin to open discussion around that.
Yeah. That's great, Jeannie. And also, by the way, just a reminder, Jeannie, I know you're talking
Mhm,
about your work being distinct.
mhm,
Just to be clear,
mhm,
we developed this training to
mhm,
be applicable and
mhm,
useful in
mhm,
any setting, regardless of your
mhm,
role,
mhm,
that we believe these skills and ideas that we're sharing with you are appropriate for
mhm,
anyone. These are not just for clinicians and
yeah,
therapists.
yeah.
I also added
Great.
here, I imagine, Jeannie, there's probably information on development just generally and developmental
Yes,
milestones. So thinking
yes,
about
Yep.
yes,
like,
yes,
your kid, like normalizing, like, oh,
yes,
like, is it, you know, like normal for my kid
yes,
to be, have not said their first word yet and they're,
yes, yes,
this many months
yes,
old or whatever it
yes,
is.
Yeah.
yes. And it's always that perspective taking, because of parents doing a support group and parents that having typically a neurotypical child is very
Yeah,
easy, but there are some of the same themes and
for sure.
struggles. They're more intensified in some ways, and
Yeah.
but it's the feeling that what I'm going through is so alien to the
Yeah.
Yeah.
general experiences of parenting, and in that way, they become more isolated from the broader community of parents and seeing them.
Yeah. And I think especially information for
Mhm.
parents
Yes,
can oftentimes be helpful.
yes,
That could also be difficult too,
yes,
but also necessary in
yes,
that work
yes,
when there may be forms of parenting
yes,
where the
yes,
parents may
yes,
have had be part of
yes,
the ACEs and the
yes,
trauma that
yes,
they may
yes,
be experiencing
yes,
in the family. And so, but also validating and providing support for that,
yes,
creating spaces
yes,
that are
yes,
safe for
yes,
parents to be able to
yes,
share about
yes,
those experiences. Yeah.
Anyone else? Folks
Anyone
wanna-
else?
I think sometimes just talking about how common it is to experience trauma, that they're not alone, that there are other people who have also experienced trauma, can feel less isolating sometimes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Just, and of course, this is all information and research, right? The ACEs study tells us how much and how common it is for folks to be exposed to it. Yeah. Reduce that sense of loneliness and isolation. Partially, not completely, but partially. Great. All right. These are great. And I think these are some of the things that can be so important to share with folks moving on. So as we think about the types of information, Jackie?
Yep. Oh, so this is just a list that we had made previously. So this is just, the types of information that might be helpful for a person. This is sort of things that you all have basically already mentioned. So signs and symptoms of trauma. Some of you mentioned also how that overlaps with other diagnoses that they might have or that they might be thinking about. Especially I think now that the young people are much more like on like social media, they might be like hearing about things like ADHD right online. And so thinking about that thinking through that with them can be helpful. Neurobiology of stress, someone mentioned that. We also put it in here sort of connecting the dots, right? That means sort of like taking things that they've said about their past experiences them and helping to connect that to the future, to what they're experiencing in the present. It's not necessarily, it is psychoeducation in the traditional sense and it isn't, right? So you're not necessarily always bringing in, but you're helping them to make sense of their experience by bringing sort of a new perspective in that way. Information on the ACEs study, social determinants of health, and then also information on coping and resiliency can be really helpful. And I'm sure there's other information that you all do share. So we're going to do another quick activity now where we're going to think about what information would potentially be helpful to somebody if they were sharing something with you, right? These are very, very brief things that, brief descriptions, and we're gonna get through, it's 1:19 right now. So, and Jim, how long do we have? We're gonna go until like 1:20, 1:30 or whatever with this, or?
Yeah.
So we're gonna do as many as we can in the next 10 minutes, but just thinking about like, if there's like thinking about this from sort of like a psychoeducation, providing information perspective, let's see what we can get for each of these. So let's start with this first one. A person is expressing feeling different or abnormal because of adversity they experienced as a child. Someone already mentioned this. I think that you all mentioned just sharing the prevalence, right? Anything else that you might share? Okay, let's go to the next one. What about someone who shares with you that they're feeling isolated and that they're feeling they're having difficulty connecting to other people or trusting other people? What's some information you might share with them that might be helpful to them in this moment?
Part of it would be validating, as we said, the experience that persons who have gone through trauma, that this is not unusual that you've experienced feelings of isolation and the ability to trust others, because in some ways your trust has been broken by that trauma experience.
Yes, so information on how trauma can impact relationships and worldview. Great. Okay, let's skip down. Person expressing feelings that they're unable to get in touch with their emotions, they're feeling numb. Let's try that one. What might you share with them?
That again, that in trauma experiences, that is not uncommon, because it was oftentimes a way of coping, the separation of feelings and the numbing of feelings. It was a way of coping and survival during the trauma experiences that they've had.
Great. Anything else from this one? The stress reaction, biological stress reaction. reaction. Great.
I'm muted. I see Melissa saying maybe that is when you education about stress reaction biologically.
Yes.
I'm not sure, Melissa, if I'm matching your response. I just looked at the chat. Perhaps that's when you explore the biological impact of
Yes.
trauma.
Let's skip down again. How about somebody is expressing that they have difficulty following rules or dealing with authority? What maybe is some information that you might share with them? I'd love to hear from someone we haven't heard from, maybe.
Be a place where the past kind of shapes the present.
Connecting the past to the present. Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit more what you might?
Sure. Yeah. I just had a client yesterday who talked a lot about his issues with police officers because he is not from America, but is an immigrant here and was treated poorly in the past. And now he has this fear of any authority.
So like something about like a lot of
Yeah.
like triggers and things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
What about anything else on this? Anyone else want to share what things you might share?
I would actually go over talk about boundaries because sometimes there's those moments of rigid or like due to their trauma, they may change their level of boundaries as well. Physical touch or verbal and such.
Great.
Further exploring that in regards to boundaries because that could be a possibility of dealing with authority as well.
Great. Let's go to the next one. Person describing how they tend to blow up easily when they're stressed, frustrated, or angry.
No, I'm in.
Thank you. All right. Yeah. Yeah. When someone says they just have a short fuse or they blow up very easily.
Thanks, Maureen. Information on grounding and meditation and how it helps us to process emotions.
And Maureen, that's a great example too. So, and we're going to talk a little bit about information. One of the great things about this, Maureen, that your comment makes me think of is information can also be used to promote, regulation, recovery, and resilience. So you could also kind of talk a little bit about if you're able to connect the dots to trauma. And this is the other important piece that you can use this as a springboard towards promoting resilience, right? What helps us to get out of that? And if you're able to connect the dots for folks, this is what trauma does, right? It increases or decreases your ability to be able to, cope with or regulate your emotions. Then these are some things that you can do to increase that. And we're going to give you some good tools for actually additional tools that you can use to provide information on that topic. Great.
I saw a really cool video kind of explaining that once that I use with some of my kids who are more visual learners of there being a trash can. And when you have experienced a lot of trauma, we kind of crumpled up a bunch of papers and it overflows really easily. But once you've processed and unpacked some of that trauma, you've folded it into papers and it's always going to be there, but you're not overflowing and about to explode all the time. So that's been a helpful tool
That's
that I've used in the
great.
past.
Yeah.
Very nice, Caitlin. Yeah.
I love that. And especially great for, like that more visual. There's also ones that I've seen the sort of using like bottles of water that are like you have bubbles in it or not bubbles in it, and how sometimes if you shake something up that has bubbles and then it explodes or it goes flat. And so thinking about that as like a way of describe. I love those sort of like ways of describing things that are a little bit more sort of like out of the box for people who learn differently.
And the interesting thing, Caitlin, we're gonna talk about the window. Oh, well, there you go. You could share that, but we're gonna talk about the window of tolerance. And what you just did was beautifully describe the window of tolerance in developmentally appropriate ways. But go ahead, Jackie. Am I covering this? Okay, yeah.
Nope. So this is sort of just a filled in version of the of that chart, with sort of like what we maybe would say that is or things you could talk about, but, you know, you can see here, there's a lot of different things you could talk about for certain things, right? So you could use the window of tolerance, which we're gonna go over, or the hand model of the brain, which we're also gonna go over. Just to raise a show of hands, how many folks are familiar with either the hand model of the brain or the window of tolerance? Okay, some yes, some no. So these are just really easy ways to describe some of those stress reactions that we're going to go over. And yeah, and then we're now going to talk, but before we go over like specific information, because a lot of that is already you maybe have access to it because of the modules or just in general. We're going to talk to you also about like how to provide information. I think that what you were just saying, was it Caitlin, about how like you have like sort of creative ways of explaining it, is great transition to sort of how we provide information. Because again, it's going to be sort of wanting to do that in that developmentally appropriate ways that, you know, addresses different learning styles, et cetera. So Jim,
Yeah.
you want to take it from here?
So just a couple of thoughts, the how, and just a suggestion, a thought that of doing it in a way that can be gentle, supportive, and connecting. So eliciting first what they know, right? Sometimes you can do that. Of course, sometimes you could just jump in and provide the information, but eliciting what folks know first, and that could be a helpful discussion to have. If that is talking about diagnoses, what do they know about the diagnoses, and what do they know about trauma? What do they know about stress and how it impacts? So eliciting first what they know, using clear, non-clinical, developmentally appropriate language. Again, Caitlin, you gave a great example of at least an exercise that you can do. And then linking that information back to them. And then, of course, providing information for the questions. Next slide. So in a lot of ways, what we're describing, this, again, we've talked about before, we integrated a lot of MI principles. This comes out of motivational interviewing. But this idea of elicit, provide, elicit. You elicit first what the person knows about the topic. They may know more than, and if they don't, then that gives you that space to provide information. Then if they do know already some information, you can provide additional information, but eliciting first what they know. What does the word trauma mean to you? How do you think your past has impacted you in the present? Asking those kinds of questions. Again, going back to our previous session around curiosity and using curiosity to help deepen our understanding of a person's experience. Then you provide the information that helps people understand it. And that could include the things that you already talked about. As I said, we've listed out some things here. We're going to go into these in a minute. ACEs, the hand model of the brain, just connecting the dots. And then eliciting that feedback from the person. Be prepared to answer questions. Be okay with not knowing too, because people might ask you questions about a topic that you're not sure about. And you could always say, I'm not, you could always sort of be transparent and share that. But again, and then also asking them what they think about that. And I think to the point that was made earlier, talk about as well feedback about what they can do and being clear about the things that they can do to support themselves, to practice self-care, to promote their own mental health. Next slide. So just we're going to go through these quickly, but connecting the dots. This is a type of information that that Jackie was referring to before. But when we talk about connecting the dots, it's just, again, that in real time, sharing with folks as they're sharing. I have problems with trust. I have problems with relationships. I have difficulties controlling my emotions, right? Oftentimes the connecting the dots type of information can be the most effective because it's tailored to the individual person's experience. Did you know that response is very common for people who've experienced trauma or toxic stress? And it's normal. So it overlaps somewhat with the validation and normalizing that we talked about last week. But validation, again, is it's understandable that you would feel. This is taking it to that next step. And so, of course, you can do these things together with each other. And this is also common for folks who have experienced a lot of trauma and adversity. So this is kind of the connecting the dots. For those folks who don't know, so I know some folks said that they mentioned, this is also a very useful model for explaining the impact of trauma and stress on the brain and our stress reaction. So it's a kind of way of helping people understand the human stress response. And so this is from Dan Siegel's work. So again, some folks know it, but the hand model of the brain, if you take your thumb and put it into the palm of your hand and roll the other 4 fingers, this is kind of a good model of the brain. The wrist is the old brain, the mammalian brain, your brain stem. Your thumb is the limbic system, the emotional center of the brain, where we think emotionally, and the 4 fingers are your neocortex. And so, Dan Siegel kind of explains it that, sometimes what happens when we're exposed, and especially if we have histories of trauma, but anytime we're exposed to stressful situations, what happens is we blow our lid. That's how he refers to it. You can always use whatever language you find more effective, but we blow our lid. Our kind of thinking brain goes offline and it's hard to think, and we're responding out of our emotional brain. And you can explain this as a way of everyday folks having difficulties dealing with stressors or extremely stressful situations. But I think it's also important to point it out to folks who've experienced trauma, because they're for the next slide, I'm going to share as well about the window of tolerance. But it's important, it can be important for them to understand that, again, stressful situations, especially if you've experienced long histories of trauma, can put you at greater risk for blowing your lid or flipping your lid. And then another one is the window of tolerance. So, again, this is Dan Siegel. We love Dan Siegel. So Dan Siegel provides this idea as well, the window of tolerance. So basically, the window of tolerance is the window in which we can tolerate and deal with stressful things. And when we're in our window of tolerance, we can handle a lot of stressful events. We can multitask. We can be very effective. And I'm saying this not only for the folks that we work with, but for us as well. When we're in our window of tolerance, we can handle quite a bit. The problem is that when that window of tolerance can shrink, and for people exposed to trauma, that window of tolerance can be very narrow. And what happens when we're outside of that window of tolerance, we can either move into hyperarousal. So this is where we can get angry, anxious, feel out of control, get overwhelmed with our emotions. Our bodies we were unable to sort of control our bodies, our thoughts, and our emotions. So we can get hyperaroused, or we can get hypoaroused. We can shut down. That's what trauma can do. It can narrow our window of tolerance. And so when we're faced with stressors and our window of tolerance is very narrow, we can move into hypoarousal as well. This, by the way, I think going back to, I forgot who mentioned, talking about the overlap between ADHD and trauma. As I mentioned earlier, this is also how you can draw the connection between trauma and depression, right? Because the hypoarousal can look like depression as well, being spacey, or it can look like being distracted, zoned out, numb, frozen, unable to move, unable to make decisions, unable to move ahead in life. So that's the window of tolerance. And then really quick, this is just a brief script that we have available. I wrote this up, so if Leslie could put that in the chat. And I say that because we're going to do a practice in a little while, so we want to give you a script if you want to use the window of tolerance. But this is kind of our attempt of explaining the window of tolerance in a way that can be helpful to folks. When we're in our window of tolerance, we can manage stressful situations pretty well. It doesn't mean that we don't get stressed. It just means that we can handle the stress without getting overwhelmed. Sometimes we get out of window of tolerance. So this is just a helpful, I'm not going to go into all detail. You all can read, but this is just a way of explaining it in down to earth. Caitlin, again, that's why I was saying earlier, that exercise that you do with kids, to me, can also kind of talk a little bit about when your cup gets filled too much, when your trash can gets filled with too much yucky stuff, which is a great way to explain it to young kids. You can get overwhelmed, and we can fill out. And so those are just some of the tools that we talk about in the guide. I just want to mention really quickly, in the guide, we have useful scripts for explaining resilience. We have useful scripts for explaining the social determinants of health. But we just wanted to give you a few ideas of things that you can put into your toolbox for explaining these various things. And then I'm going to turn it over to Jackie to bring us into an exercise that we're going to do today.
Awesome. How's everyone doing? Any questions or thoughts about what we've gone over so far, or Does this sort of resonate with folks in terms of like being useful information that you could share with the folks you work with? Amazing. So we're gonna practice now applying this to our friends Carrie and Michael. Not friends, our clients, Carrie and Michael. So we're going to go into breakout rooms and we're going to read vignettes, and you'll notice these are actually the same narratives that you got in our last session. So these are actually like the exact same narratives. You've already heard this monologue before. If you want to choose to do the same, I think everyone did Carrie last time. So if you all wanted a little variety and you want to choose Michael, you're welcome to do that. You're also, if you want to see what it's like to apply this to the same narrative you already gone through, that's also totally fine. What you're going to do is you're going to read through that narrative again, just to refamiliarize yourself with it. And you're going to talk as a group of what information you're going to do, essentially what we did in the exercise earlier, where we talked about what information would be useful. You'll think through what information could be useful to this client right now. So maybe it's that they need information about resilience. Maybe it's that they need information about the window of tolerance. Maybe it's that they need information that helps them sort of connect that past, their past and their present. You can decide what you think is most useful. There's no right answer here. So there's a variety. We purposefully made these narratives so that there's a variety of different directions you could go. And then we're going to ask you all to either script out some specific talking points, the way that Jim did in sort of those previous slides. He had some sort of like scripts, or if you prefer, you can role play it. We know that people love role playing. And it is actually a useful way to learn. So if you all decide that you want to role play it, as opposed to writing it, we really encourage you to do that. But you could also write down if you prefer to sort of do it in a more written form. That's also totally acceptable. These are in that handout packet you have, which I believe, if Leslie, if you would mind adding that to the chat, just in case folks don't have it available. I believe it's pages, what did I say, 7 and 9 or something like that. You'll see it says like session 4. And then there's again the same, there's one for Carrie and one for Michael. What questions do you have before we break you out?
You got the handouts there. And by the way, I think to Jackie's point, if you role play, you can also feel free to use what we talked about with EPE and, all up to build it into the role play. But so please feel free to use that if you choose.
Yes. And so we're going to give you, let's see, it's 1:40. And when are we supposed to be done with this? We're going to bring you back. We're going to give you between 15 and 20 minutes. We're going to hop into the different rooms as well, just to check on you all. But if you are like sitting there and you're all done, just message us so that we know. But we'll give you between 15 and 20 minutes to do this. And then we're going to come back and talk about how it went. Whenever you all are whenever you're ready, Leslie, we can break folks out.
I was just going to add to Jackie, if you have time, if you kind of get it with one, you could also apply it to the other as well. So feel free to use that time to use multiple. Just debrief and talk a little bit about this activity for you all. What did folks come up with? How did you decide what information to provide? I'm sorry, Jackie, I know this is you too, so.
No, is everyone back?
Oh, I think so. Oh, is everyone back?
I don't know. Leslie, is everybody back?
All the breakout rooms are closed?
We'll give it a couple seconds.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
How dare you, Jim?
But certainly if anybody wants to start us off, the other group will join us momentarily if they're not here already.
So yeah, I'd love to hear from groups. It's from the two groups I saw, it seemed like people decided to stick with Carrie. I don't know if that was the third group's decision as well. I'm wondering sort of how you all did, and specifically also how did you just, there's a lot of stuff in those those narratives. So like, how did you decide what direction to go in and what information to provide to the client that you chose? I'd love to hear from a group or two.
We started off in talking about the piece, the brain, and that she says that there's something wrong with her brain, and feeling, you know, the information piece that we would give is the hand model, that piece. But before that, some eliciting where does that come from? Her thinking about that something's faulty or wrong with her brain, to get an idea if she, people have said that to her, or has she been in treatment, had treatment before, where those issues were discussed. So to get a sense, elicit what she knows about the brain. Does she have had trauma work before, or so that's good. And then we
Okay.
would give information about the hand model.
Great. Yeah. So you decided to focus in on sort of the first kind of things,
Yeah.
both in like eliciting where she's coming from, expressing some curiosity, and then providing some information about the brain and the stress response, both to sort of normalize and also to provide some sort of help her make those connections. Any other groups? What all did you decide to, what information do you feel like was useful, going to be useful to your client, and then that you decided to go with? And
I saw that there was about maybe like 6 different sections in the narrative that like deal with emotions. So developing coping tools and normalizing sounded important for those topics.
So you listened to patterns and felt like doing some sort of like normalizing and coping. I love that. So how did you all decide to introduce the information to the client? So, and I guess that, I mean, I guess you could just tell us a little bit about, like, maybe you developed a script, maybe you role played. Just tell us a little bit about how that went and sort of what choices you made in terms of how to introduce stuff.
I think we tried to focus on the stuff that felt most pertinent to the client, without like doing too much too, and kind of taking over the session and not like overwhelming the client.
Great. And how does one do that? Like, how do you achieve that balance?
Because that's right on, Caitlin, right? You don't want to go into a
how do you not do
dissertation.
too much?
Yeah, you don't. It's real simple.
We didn't really talk about it as a group, but I'll say just making sure that you're being clear and concise, and just making sure, kind of reflecting, like, am I, and like watching for body, facial expressions, body cues as this client's starting to get overwhelmed. Am I taking over this session when really it's their turn to be sharing what they're going through?
Yeah.
And Caitlin, did you all role play this, or did you decide to write out a script?
We wrote it out.
Wrote it out.
Yeah. And again, I just, this is one area where we always, kind of have shared the guide with you. And in the section, we have a lot of examples, and we've given some today. But I think your point, Caitlin, is so important. It has to be brief, and it has to be clear, and obviously relevant. So I think those are the things. So when we kind of wrote out some scripts for you, and again, you can just consider them. But typically, yeah, you want to keep it short and simple.
What about other groups? How did you all decide to, what was it like introducing it to the client? Maybe somebody role played, or if you wrote it out. I'd like to hear about other groups, what you ended up doing. So once you decided, tell me about what it was like moving forward.
If I may, I just wanted to ask, also the idea of like that bridge, because I know Maureen and Melissa and Sarah in your group, we were talking about how do you connect the information to then what are some ways of coping? Because I know one of the other groups talked about coping. How do you connect that bridge, bridge those two, providing the information, and then moving into what you can do to cope, deal, heal?
I,
And I only say that too because I think sometimes one of the things that we know about trauma and trauma-informed care, when we hear some of the criticisms and people get concerned, is that if you just focus on the trauma, right? Like somebody says they think they're damaged or their brain is, like people walking around with that. How do you provide that hope? Because people walking around with the idea that their brain is damaged, that there is no hope.
Yeah, I talk a lot
So-
about
oh,
this.
excuse me.
Yeah, sorry.
No,
The
go ahead. Yep.
yeah, so most of my clients, they're like, well, what do I do with this? Like, I can't sleep. I'm having night terrors. I'm having panic attacks. I'm not leaving my house. I have this fear, like, whatever it is, however it surfaces. You know, they're like, I just don't feel well, right? So they're having trauma responses. It's a real physical effect. And what do they do with it? We can talk all day about trauma, but then what do they do? So a lot of like healing the nervous system and referring to EMDR specialists, or like really tangible things that they can do to heal from the trauma is a lot of what I do.
Great. Yeah, and that's the purpose of this section, right? If you can provide information and then think about what to do with this. I know you're talking about possibly referring to a specialist. There's trauma. I know in the group that I sat in on for a minute, sometimes it could be collaterals, right? For some folks, the challenge is, might also be very basic, right? Maslow's hierarchy, taking care of their kids and putting food on the table, things like that. That increase that stress level, right? So
I
what
think
do you
the
do?
other thing is that you use that it sounds like you're using the information as a bridge between like helping them to understand their experience so that when you do introduce a coping skill, that it makes sense why, right? It's almost like the rationale, right? I'm not telling you to do this mindfulness exercise or whatever because I just think it's like cool, right? It's
Right.
because this is the way that it's specifically connected to what you said and what you're asking in terms of what you want, right? Like you're telling me this about what your experience is, you're telling me this is what you would like to see happen. I would like to be able to sleep. I would like to be able to feel more engaged with my child. I would like to be able to feel more capable, in terms of my emotional regulation abilities, like whatever it is that the person is expressing a desire for, and then helping them to like connect those things. Okay, like part of the connection is helping them to understand what the origins of things are. And then part of it is that very concrete, like what can we do? But it's also about being like, we're not just going to do random things, right? These are the reasons why, and also what are you already doing? Right. That's one of the reasons
Right.
that
What works for you? What,
Right.
yeah. Because everyone's a little bit different where they can't sit and do a
100%.
meditation. They don't have the means to like go on the internet and do a sound bathing
100%.
exercise or whatever. And it's like, well, what works for you? That's what we need to figure out.
100%. Jim and I were talking about the safe place visualization, really helpful for a lot of people. For the young people, when I was, like doing my most of my clinical work, like early in my career, there was no safe place for those kids. And it honestly was frustrating for them when you ask them to picture a safe place, they're like, I don't feel safe anywhere. So don't ask me to do this, right? That's not going to work for them. Some of them, it was for a kid who's like, I don't like art, giving them a sketchbook is not going to be helpful. But for a kid who can get lost in a sketchbook, that is going to be something that is going to be helpful for them, right? So you're going to want to meet them where they are no matter what. And then again, also make sure that you're connecting it back to what they actually want and need. That's great. Any other things about this before we wrap up? What felt challenging about this? Whether this, things that maybe you thought about that you hadn't thought about previously? What do you think would be different doing this, or what is different when you do this with clients?
Well, with clients, you're dealing with a living, breathing organism, and they are going to have a range of responses. And the attunement piece and being cued in and
Can Did anyone role play it, just out of curiosity?
Sorry about that.
It's okay. There's a reason why we give options.
Yeah.
Because that is one
Yeah.
way to help deal with that attunement piece, right? Is to have someone actually embody that client.
Yeah.
So, you know.
And Jeannie, yeah, and thank you for bringing that back, because again, you know, as we talk about all these skills, of course, we talk about them differently and we talk about them discreetly, but they're all related to each other, right? And that process of trying to find what fits is really a process of attunement, trying to fit in what works, right? What
And
is
when you-
the way of coping that helps that
And when
individual.
you think of trauma and you think of people who have the short fuses, there's a lot of anger and a lot of disorganization and stuff to get through,
Yep.
to get to
Yeah.
this point.
And again, that understanding of that anger is understandable, and this is why it's understandable. Okay, so
we're gonna,
sorry, go ahead, Jackie.
Yeah, no, we're just going to transition. I mean, this is sort of a perfect transition because we're going to transition now specifically discussing coping and regulation. So again, when we're talking, this first section is a lot of this is sort of helping people to understand their experience, their reality. So this is, oh, like, I feel like there's something wrong with me. And also you've told me that, you know, in your childhood, you felt like, you know, blah, 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 blah. And so helping them to sort of connect those dots. And then also another piece of type of information is helping them to manage that reality. So it's, again, like we were just talking about, what do I do about this? You know, we can talk about how I have night terrors or how I can't concentrate or all of those things, but what do I do about it? And that's where we also can move. So often we're pairing these two things. We're pairing, providing sort of like the understanding the rationale with concrete things, whether it's a referral to a specialist or whether it's, you know, coping skills, or whether it's just thinking about what's worked for them in the past. And again, we're going to think about what we are going to share with folks when we introduce different things to folks, and then also how to do it in a way that's useful and clear. So I'd love to hear from folks what you currently do in terms of sharing, about people's
regulation.
Like what do you already do in terms of talking through things with folks?
What have you found help? What are some of your go-to strategies that you find that helps folks develop regulation skills?
Well, I have a different perspective since I'm in a school setting with very young, with preschoolers, with different ranges of capacities, of course, with developmental disabilities, but a lot is the children present with, you know, developmental delays and things like that, and certainly self-regulation issues. So really working with staff in terms of, because many trauma can look like many things and in young children, and helping staff to provide trauma informed responses and environment to our children. So the issues of, we may not ever know what that trauma is that child has experienced, but in the school environment, to provide a safe environment in terms of what helps young children feel safe, routines, relationships, and these are the things that build resilience in terms of young children, in terms of young children understanding their own feelings and that they have feelings and emotions, and help them to co-regulate with them when they're tantruming and that kind of thing. You know, having the calming corner, and to not just send the child to the calming corner, but to model and to mirror for the child, and help to co-regulate, to help them manage their emotions and understand their emotions through lots of visuals and support.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeannie. And then I see, just if you look in the chat for everyone, Holly put in Heal Your Nervous System by Dr. Linnea Passler. So if and she put in a link to a site. But I'm just curious, Holly, and if you want to share more, what do you find of these?
Sure.
And it might be, of course, no one size fits all, but
Yeah. Well, that's the great thing about this, and that's why I really go back to this particular resource. And the website's really helpful because not all of our clients are readers. This is there is some jargon, so I really only recommend the book to specific clients, but the website's really straightforward if they have access to it, but it just gives a nice clear list that they can then kind of take and go through. It's like a list of like 47 different ways to regulate their nervous system. The book is more about like healing the nervous system. So it breaks it down from like breathing exercises, meditation, grounding techniques, sound bathing, music, nature, et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of like they can go through the list and see what works for them, but then also cycle through them, because what works one day or one week might not work the next week or the next day, or they get bored of it or whatever. So I just say fill up as much of your toolbox with this stuff as you can, to build it into your routine. Don't just do it when you're having a rough day. We need to do this regularly to then kind of keep our baseline down and regulate it as much as we can, so we have a little bit more wiggle room when life is stressful or we have trauma responses, etc. In a nutshell, there's a lot more to it.
And yeah, there's a lot, right? I don't think there's a nutshell there, but there's like so much, right? There's so much, but I think it is that what I'm hearing you say is this process of trying to find what fits and works for that individual. And oftentimes that can be the therapy itself. So I see, Jackie, you're pulling those all in from the chat. You want to highlight some of those?
Yeah, so I see a lot of folks using somatic and sort of like grounding techniques, like the five senses kind of. So I you know, that whether that's scent, like a rollerball or essential oils, slime, a lot of people talking about creative things like you know, doing things like sort of almost like art therapy kind of exercise, like that kintsugi. I also really like what Sarah just put in around building awareness. So whether, you know, using that sort of like a kid's book or just building just awareness to be able to name feelings. And then also going back to somebody, I don't remember who put this in the chat, let's see, Anna, about sort of those early somatic signs. So getting them in touch with like sort of like, what does this feel like in my body when I'm starting to get activated, as opposed to like when I'm at a 10 or 100 or whatever the scale is you use. So like getting sort of like some of those, like, what are my early warning signs? Yeah, I love all of the creativity that folks do. That's great.
I was just gonna say, one of the things that's been really effective for me with even teaching people that is I'll often give it as a homework assignment. Because people don't, I'll say to people like, what do you notice when you get upset? And they'll be like, nothing. I don't get a, you know, I just go 0 to 100, and not like to that as a sort of like, so it's like psychoeducation moment of like, I like not to invalidate them that I don't believe them, but like, that's really interesting because it's actually like most people do feel something, and it sounds like it's really hard for you to notice right now what you're feeling before. And I'll like often give them like, do your hand shake? Does your stomach hurt? Does your heart rate go up? And if sometimes people are like, oh yeah, that does happen for me. And if they're still like, no, I can't. And I'm like, can you next time you get a little bit annoyed, like maybe not full blown, but just a little bit, can you notice anything that like starts to make like any somatic thing? And they'll often come back and be like, oh yeah, I noticed my hand started to shake. Because it's like, it's very, very unusual that they would have, if they're really getting told, like if you're really like flipping your lid, like
right,
that you wouldn't have any somatic sign before it happens.
And sometimes it's also like getting them to create that space, right? And that's part of like the work, is that like you actually are pretty numbed out to it till you're at 100, right? Like that's part of how you've coped. And so is there a way that we can stretch this out? And also maybe you have blocked out those somatic signs because it's too uncomfortable to be in contact with them. And so can we sort of do that in a way that's safe? I used to offer groups that we did this this sort of kind of check-ins and stuff a lot, and you'd ask them to rate themselves on a scale of, on 2 different scales, actually, like how in control are you and how distressed are you? And I remember in like the beginning of the group, I'd get kids coming and be like, I'm a 1 and a 1, 1 and 1, I'm fine. I'm a 1 and 1. I'm like, I literally just watched you get in a fight outside the classroom. Like, I don't think that that is true, but like, sure. But I wouldn't say that, but over time, like also that's the other thing about practicing this over time can also be helpful because it does take some time, right? It is a skill to be able to like have that sort of like introspection and like interoception as well. Like, what does this feel like in my body? Can be really
And one of the things too, Anna and for others, I notice, and maybe you all notice too, the thing with trauma, right? And it's not just if they're talking about the trauma narrative, right, where they may become distressed, but also oftentimes people will share the stories in very dramatic ways, right? It's almost like they're re-experiencing it. And oftentimes I use those opportunities, Anna, to note it, right? Like as someone's telling me, and of course they're at, the teacher did this and threw me in the thing, and I was just, and they obviously they get distressed in those moments and dysregulated. That's a great time to bring some of this stuff in, because sometimes I'll say, look, I can see you sharing with it. I can see how upset you're getting, and I can see how much this is affecting you now. And I'll use that as an opportunity to teach regulation. Let's take a quick deep breath or a quick step back, and then maybe do some. But again, there's always those opportunities as well. Jack, and I hear you, Jackie. Sometimes again, especially young kids could come in and nothing's going on. But so really quick, I just wanted to share a couple of things. So we're going to do another exercise in a little while, but before we get there, I just want to actually, Jack, if you can go to the previous one. Really quick. So I just bring this back up again, just as a reminder, right? I think this is helpful. Again, you could use it as a psychoeducational tool or informational tool, but it's also a good way to think about. I like this window of tolerance because it helps to understand why you can get both, right? Those hyper-aroused states and hypo-aroused states. So it's useful. And then next slide. So it's also useful because then it gives me a way of thinking about folks can be in one or the other predominantly, right? Some folks can go between the two, right? By the way, what do we call these things sometimes? So, and I also appreciate it because you can talk about it without having to talk about diagnoses, right? Conduct disorder or ADHD or oppositional defiant disorder. You could talk about those things in terms that make more sense to folks, right? Hypoarousal being more like depressed, numb, disaffected. But I also appreciate it because it gives you some ideas of organizing the various coping strategies you can do. So if you can go back to hyperarousal, of course.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. So what we normally do, and I think what we normally focus on or often focus on, is the regulation of hyperarousal, right? So many of you touched on this: breathing techniques, mindfulness exercises, self-soothing activities, and we'll go into that. Finding that safe space, real or imagined. Jeannie talked about the real safe space, maybe the safe space in the room. Imagined, you're doing it in a visualization. Physical activities can help sensory. So these are just ways of thinking about it, organizing. And then for hypoarousal, right, you want to get folks activated. So movement, walking, workouts, running, jumping jacks, engaging the senses, right? Warm baths, sometimes, cold water on the face, candles. Many of you touched on these. Listening to upbeat music, brain stimulating activities like puzzles and games, and sunlight and outdoors. So again, I find the window of tolerance helpful to be able to just very simply sort of give you two kind of ways of approaching or thinking about the kinds of regulation strategies you want to use depending on what the person is experiencing. Next slide. And then, Jackie, I know you wanted to talk a little bit about distraction activities.
Yeah, one thing that I sometimes find that can be useful. So there's this, I think she's based at Harvard, but this Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor, she does a lot of work around around emotion and like the neuroscience of emotion, and talking about sort of like how like emotional impulses don't actually last that long in the brain. And so sometimes I can feel it depends on the kid, right? Or the adult, right? Who you want to do this with. It's important to make sure that they understand that it's not about avoidance, right? So, but having them do things like whether it's grounding to help them to like ride out that emotional impulse so that they can then become back. So distraction can actually be a really useful tool. So helping them to sort of do things to get their mind when they're in that sort of heightened emotional state to help them to come back down, so that they can then go back to it later. So again, it's not something that they do to avoid it forever, but it's so that they can deal with whatever is going on in a more regulated state. And I feel like it goes nicely also with that self-soothing, because it's sort of like those are the distract and self-soothe are those sort of two distress tolerance kinds of skills that you can help them to think through. And some kids are going to prefer one versus the other. And I say kids, but it could, you know, adults as well. One thing that I used to do a lot was I used to, you know, someone's saying they make like lavender balls. I used to make like calming jars. And, you know, calming jars are often like pitched as things for little kids. I found that 16 and 17-year-olds love them. Even older kids really like them. So I feel like, you know, having things like that that you do with them can be really fun. And it also becomes like a project. But whether it's, you know, visual, like a calming jar, or whether it's something like, you know, soothing, you know, a stress ball, whatever it is, those can also, it's sort of the distract and self-soothe, I feel like are those sort of two things that can help them to ride out that emotional impulse so that they can come back to it later when they're, and I say later, I mean, it doesn't have to be much later, but when they are more regulated, so they can deal with whatever the impulse was that led to that dysregulation initially. And a lot of these things you can build in, there's a lot of ways to build this in, right? So you can do it as part of the work you do together. So you can, you know, this is something, there is a goal of theirs to be able to regulate more, and you can build it into your like treatment plan with them. You can also do it as just sort of like a modeling at the beginning and end of session. So you know, like sometimes you can say, okay, like let's check in and do a like mindfulness exercise at the beginning of our session every single time. You can also practice it when they're getting upset in the moment, though that is not always the best time to learn a new skill. Their brain is not really taking in new information then. So it's often good to introduce things before they are getting upset, but it doesn't mean we can't help them to practice it in the moment. And so helping them to sort of process those things, and then also to help them prepare for difficult situations. So you are starting a new school, you are going to see a new doctor, you are going to have to do a oral presentation in front of your class. Like, how are we going to prepare for these stressful moments? So there's a variety of different ways that you can integrate the strategies. And then in terms of how, I think, and Jim, I don't know if you wanted to.
Well, yeah, no, it's again very similar to what we talked about earlier with EPE, right? So again, in motivational interviewing, you want the person to come up with the solutions. But EPE, just as a reminder, is just a way of being able to introduce something where you may put in your suggestions. You can sort of prompt folks. And this is a way of doing it that can be a little bit more empowering. So just the same principle we talked about earlier, explore what they already know. How do you know when you're feeling stressed? What thoughts go through your mind? This is all the stuff you've already talked about with regards to understanding the problem well. Where do you feel it in their body? So try to do some of that. But yeah, how do you know when you're stressed? And doing some work. And again, just to be clear, we realize for some folks, this can take time. It can take more than just one conversation. And then meet them where they're at, assess their readiness, use CLEAR so you can provide some ideas about what could help. Again, assessing their readiness, using clear, non-clinical, developmentally appropriate language about what can help, what is a grounding activity, what is mindfulness, again, in as simple ways as you can, if those are the kinds of things that you're doing. And then match the technique to what you already know about the person. So just that reminder, this is why, again, understanding the history, understanding the kinds of forms of trauma that they've experienced can become so important, because it helps you know whether there are boundary issues, whether there are sensory issues, whether there are concerns about touch and proximity to others. And then you can also kind of normalize skepticism emphasize options. And what I mean by that is you can float things out to folks, and we all realize sometimes you get folks who say, no, I'm not ready to do that. I have a client who I can't get him to breathe. I don't even try it anymore, but just breathing for him is almost very difficult to do. So, but yeah, normalize the skepticism. And sometimes saying, I know it sounds, I will oftentimes say, I know it sounds strange to just ask you to breathe, but sometimes it can just give you that one, and this is the rationale, pairing it with the rationale, but sometimes it can give you that just one moment that you need. And sometimes I have clients who will, through the work, will say, I go from 0 to 60, go 0 to 100 like that. And sometimes you can connect the dots if you know the history. So providing that clear rationale, and then consider creating a ritual around it, as we discussed earlier. So these are just some of the things that you can do and building awareness. Sorry, we have a little bit more. So again, some other questions as you explore the issues around their dysregulation. So you can explore, how do you know, again, when it is. You can use scaling questions. How upset, how angry, how sad, how anxious, how nervous are you? So being able to sort of fill in the blank and scale it. And then sort of in the moment exploration, as I mentioned earlier, building that awareness, doing this throughout. When you are picking up on distress, being able to name it. What are you feeling right now? What are sensations are you having? So Anna, as I was mentioning earlier, sometimes the best way to teach this is live, in situ. And now I think we're going to move into our practice activities.
Okay. It is. Okay, so we're going to have between about 20 minutes for this activity. And we are going to ask you to role play. I know that everyone does not seem to be, but we're not going to ask you to play anybody other than yourself.
It's a real play.
It's a real play, as they call it in the biz. So essentially we're going to be breaking you up into pairs, and one of you is going to be the client and the other one is going to be the provider. You can decide amongst yourselves which one you want to be. If you have time to do both and switch it up, great. And if not, there'll be other chances to practice. So if you're the client, just tell the provider about a time you feel stressed out. It can be in the past, it can be in the present, it can be ongoing stress, whatever you want. And then as the provider, this is your chance to sort of explore what use these skills that we just talked about today, exploring what they're already doing. Maybe if you want to provide a little bit of information to them to help them understand their experience. And then also potentially feel out, is it appropriate to introduce them to a new skill, and then try to do that. So if you're the client, you can also decide if you want to pretend to be somebody else. By the way, it doesn't have to be something that is causing you, if you don't feel comfortable sharing your own personal sense of stress, you can always make something up. But yeah, and we're going to give you, again, about 15-ish minutes in the rooms, and then we're going to come back and we'll talk about it together.
Jackie?
Yes?
I wanted to mention, and Leslie, if you could drop those. So we create, again, we did it in case folks don't have, but it sounds like you all have tools. We did drop in, or Leslie's going to drop in a few exercises. I put together a list of different breathing exercises. So if you want to use this opportunity in your role play, real play, to practice using a breathing exercise, practice just with the material. There's some breathing exercises you can try, and different forms of breathing exercises, paced breathing, belly breathing, a few different exercises. I also put in the safe space script. So the safe space script can often, Jackie mentioned it earlier, sometimes it's difficult for folks to engage in that. But if you want to use that safe space meditation, you can also use that and use this as an opportunity to practice something you might not have used before. I should say that safe space script is also, somebody mentioned EMDR earlier. EMDR, the safe space script is often, that activity as an exercise is often used with folks who are in EMDR, getting EMDR, because it creates that place where folks can go when they become either dissociative or disconnected. So just a few things that you can use if you'd like. They're in the chat. I'm sorry, Jackie.
Okay, so we're gonna have 15 minutes in the rooms, and then we'll come back. Any questions before we send you out? Okay. Okay. Well, as people are joining, I know we have a couple people still left to join us. I would love to hear from folks about what that was like. Let's maybe hear from somebody who was a client first. What was it like to be the client? Anyone
It was
Um,
vulnerable.
who was vulnerable? Okay.
I think for me, it was utilizing clients that I've met with and their story and incorporating it in the scenario to be
Yeah.
able to kind of be in their shoes in a way. And also
Totally,
like show
totally
the,
valid.
yeah. And those
Oh,
statements that they like to say, like, I've tried everything or I've done this.
yeah. Oh, it's so hard when someone has told you that they've tried everything. It's like, well, okay, go to my spot, I guess. You know? Right. So, and so that's some initial impressions from folks who are clients. Let's hear initial impressions from folks who were providers.
It gave me flashbacks. So I was with Jeannie and she mentioned certain things. I was like, oh, this reminds me of such and such when they would say this. Um, so I think for me, when it came down for me being the provider, it was just utilizing just strategies that I've used with other clients, or also how to even introduce myself, or kind of like provide kind of like a guide the client in a way, and asking certain questions but not dominating the conversation. It's more like active listening, and then even providing this, like, would you allow me to introduce this strategy, like asking for permission as well, because sometimes when we say like, hey, we're going to do this, it's just, is it mutual or is it one-sided?
For sure, for sure. Like really checking in to make sure that you're
And,
actually meeting them where they are.
and thanks for bridging some stuff, Lourdes, because right, like just to be clear, right, this stuff doesn't work in a vacuum, right? You don't go to someone and say, let's, start breathing or try mindfulness or try meditation, because you don't know. So this is going back to what we talked. This is kind of bringing it all together. You have to know the client. You have to know what they've been through, be able to understand what stresses them out, what distresses them, what puts them into hypo or hyper arousal, if you want to use those terms, right? So it doesn't work as well when you're just throwing things out there, because I think oftentimes that's what folks who've been exposed to trauma have gotten their whole lives. Take a walk, relax, do this, do that. And oftentimes they can be just as oppressive as the things that people have done before, right? Like, so I'm glad you said that, Lourdes. It could be really hard for the person sitting in to be told what to do to regulate yourself, because they've heard it their whole lives. Not that these things aren't important. They're so important. In fact, they're critical to helping folks heal. It's the way that you do it and the way you get there.
And
Others.
I just want to say with Lourdes, that piece asking, I think people asking what the client has done on their own in terms of addressing their, the concerns that we each had as the client. What have you,
Mhm.
has anything worked for you?
Jeannie, I love that too, because I often at the front end of my work, I'll start there. And I try to keep it real simple. And I'll from, of course, as a therapist, but you can do this in whatever role you're in. And I might say something like, that's, and oftentimes, to be honest, I mean, raise a hand if you've heard this. The strategies people use are actually pretty good. They'll say, I take a walk, I distract myself, I listen to music, right? So I always kind of try to say my role is those are really good and they work, but I'm wondering if there's some others that we can work on together and add to your toolkit. And I'll use those kind of simple terms, but maybe there are other things that we can do together to add to the tools that you have. So you're validating where they're at, but also thinking about what more others.
Kind of brought up like some of the coping tools that she used at the end when we were talking back and forth. And I forgot, because I haven't been working with clients for a while, but I'm back to working with clients, that I used to put them up on my bulletin boards, and I had a coping tools wall where people, like the kids, would add to it. And other people could look at it if they wanted it, and they could say, you know, they didn't have to use them if they didn't want to, but they could bring it up in the conversation themselves.
I love that. That's great.
Absolutely. That's great.
It also is especially great because it's like not coming from you, right? So it doesn't feel, it's like, it's an equalizer, right? This is coming from someone just like me. And not because I know who they are, but you know, it is sort of like, it's not like a professional technique, a therapy technique. It's just a technique. And so it can be a little bit more accessible for folks. I like that.
Yeah.
Especially with kids, right? Like adults don't get what me or what I need as a kid or as a young person.
Yeah.
Well, this is coming from potentially someone else my age. So
I'm curious, two questions, and I know one is, did anyone try anything new, and then, or did anyone learn anything new? So the person you were working with, did someone try something with you that you learned as a new kind of regulation strategy? Maybe not. Other thoughts?
I think, oh, wait a minute, I muted.
Oh, Jeannie, I think if you're trying to share, you're muted.
Okay, I think one of the things to keep in mind when you're working with adults and young adults are the cultural aspects, the historical aspects of discrimination, the acceptance of therapy and treatment in certain communities. That is something you're crazy, you know, there's nothing wrong with you, that you have to combat, work through some of those pieces before you get, in terms of what are you talking about, breathing and all this kind of thing. I'm not crazy or that kind of thing, because those are real variables that impact people when they come for help.
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, you know, and the crazy issue, right? Obviously, we have a lot of stigma around mental health in our society in general, of course, and culturally, I think that comes up. But to me, again, just to pair that with the discussion about education, right? The information that's so important, and this is why these two things kind of work well together, which is, you know, no, you're not. No, but you've been through a lot of trauma, right? You've been through a lot of adversity. And that can sometimes create that shift for folks, right? From this medical model of mental illness to a trauma-informed model that says it's obviously, right, it's not about what's wrong with you, but what happened. The other thing I want to mention, Jeannie, and actually somebody mentioned it earlier, I think it was maybe Lourdes, somebody also mentioned the idea of authority figures. And I'm glad, and apologies that we haven't taken a deep dive on cultural issues around and cultural responsiveness, but you're right, Lourdes, I think you talked a little bit about validation around authority figures, right? That's also an important place to bring in that discussion around authority figures. And certainly, you know, certain groups oftentimes are also traumatized because of their race, their gender, gender identity, all of these. So oftentimes validating and providing that information as well, not just the trauma you experience, but the ongoing trauma you may experience as a result of being confronted by authority figures. And then similarly here, yeah, that it's really important to have that thinking around culture and how different folks process their lives. Many years ago, I did a training around trauma, and somebody, it was with Latino families, it was in the Latino community, and I remember someone saying, you know, we're Latino, we don't process by breathing. We process by commiserating. We process by talking, and we process sometimes just by commiserating and validating each other's like pain and suffering. And that kind of hit me. But sometimes that also plays a role as well, finding those safe spaces to talk to others that, you know, kind of are going through the same thing. So with that said, I think any final thoughts? The bottom line is, again, with regulation strategies, I just want to say it's all about regulation. Well, actually, no, because I said already it's all about validation. So validation leads to regulation. But yeah, those two things are so critically important. You can spend all of your time in your work just doing those two things, promoting validation and promoting regulation. Jackie, any other thoughts? Oh, okay. Yep. Oh, so just a few things. So just to wrap up today, is just next week. So we did providing information, supporting regulation. Next week is connecting to supports. Again, Maureen, I think you mentioned it earlier. You know, sometimes collaterals can be important. Collaterals, right? So for folks who've been traumatized, and especially folks who've gone through complex trauma, sometimes they have multiple service needs. They're involved in multiple organizations, or have concrete needs, as well as, of course, mental health needs and others. So, but doing it in a way that's supportive. How do you connect people to the supports and help that they need in a supportive, trauma-informed way? That's what we're going to be focusing on next week, in addition to, and we're going to end with sustaining the work that is promoting compassion, resilience. How do we support you, or how do you get the support that you all need in doing this very difficult work of working with folks who've been exposed to trauma? So we're going to end with some work around, we don't want to use the word self-care. We want to use the term compassion, resilience, helping you sort of to continue to sort of promote your own resilience in the work that you do. So that's what we're going to end next week. Nuggets of wisdom, please share through the chat, or unmute yourself. A couple of nuggets of wisdom. And by the way, I'm going to ask Leslie to put the survey in the chat in case anyone needs to jump out early. Please, I guarantee you, I'm telling, we do look at the evals and we look at your feedback. So we so appreciate it. So please, Leslie, just put the eval in there in case some folks have to leave early. So complete that Qualtrics survey and give us your feedback. Nuggets of wisdom, what are you walking away with? Please feel free to chat in or unmute yourself. What from today has been helpful to you in your work? What are your takeaways?
I think it was, I liked how you guys broke it down between hyperarousal and hypoarousal. Because I do have clients who are like, I don't have motivation to do any of what you're suggesting. So it's like, again, finding what works for them, but having them be part of that.
Yeah,
So
that
that's a
shared
good first
decision.
step.
Yeah, collaboration and shared decision making around how to proceed.
Right.
I think if we all recognize that regulation is just critical, then the work becomes focused on that and how you get folks to do that in a
right
passionate way. Anna has use of scaling to think about regulation, particularly liked how in control are you, how distressed are you? Yeah, scaling questions are always, that's great because it just gives you that marker, right? How do we get you from an 8 down to a 2? Or in some cases, right, so scaling questions can be really important to just quantify it and make it concrete. But the other thing I like about scaling questions is the scaling question means that the person has to think about their response. Right there, you're engaging the neocortex. You're engaging their thinking brain, right? So that scaling and those questions can be really helpful as well to engage their problem-solving centers. Others?
Our own sense of regulation and where we are. Can you hear me? The provider's sense of regulation, because that's so important.
Thank you. Yeah. And look, and this goes back to, again, this is how all of this is really interconnected. Remember at the front end, we talked about the importance of your own regulation, your judgments, being able to regulate yourself and prepare yourself and center yourself when you're getting into this work. So, and I'm just going to say it, you can't regulate others unless you're regulated. You can't help others with their regulation. And by the way, by regulating yourself, everything we know about mirror neurons and attunement tells us that the more regulated you are, that alone is a regulation intervention. Meeting the clients where they're at. Thank you, Christina. Always. And yeah, And you know what? And I appreciate you saying that, Christina, because we always say that. What I hope is that what we're doing in this work, and please give us feedback if we're doing this, is defining what it means to meet a client where they're at, because we always use that term. But what we're trying to do is define that. Thank you. What that means. So great. Any last thoughts?
Something that I learned early on in work with.
Oh, Jeannie, you're muted. Jeannie?
Jeannie, you're
That
muted.
unmute. Yes. The something that I learned early on is you don't always need words throughout a whole session or interaction. The power of silence.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes just being with a person and being able to hold that space with them. Thank you. Well, with that said, we have 1 minute. What I'd like to do is just give you this last minute. Please take this last minute to complete and/or start the survey, and give us as much feedback as you can. And we honestly mean it. Be tough on us. We're still kind of working on developing this, but so we hope that you're getting what you need out of this. And with that said, well, actually, we'll just give you all a minute till 3. We're going to be okay with silence. All righty, folks. I know it's 3 o'clock. Again, I hope you either started or finished with that feedback. Thank you all for another great session. Jackie.
Thanks, everybody. We really appreciate it. Really take your feedback seriously. So and if there's something you think of through the week that you want to email Jim or myself about, either about the sessions themselves or about anything we talk about, we're always here for you. So I just want to make sure that everyone knows that. And I can't believe that next week is our last session. Kind of crazy. 5 weeks went by really fast. And yeah, we're excited to see you all.